that it's not as bad as it seems. I decided to call John Williams. He's a guy who has done shadow stats. I think we talked to John when I was over at CNN, and he is a guy who said, John, first of all, what are your qualifications? I'm trying to remember. You were...
I've been a consulting economist for 30 years.
Okay.
I have an MBA out of the Tuck Business School, majored in economics at Dartmouth.
So, but you're a guy who, said, wait, we've got to go look at the real stats. And so you're calculating the best you can the way the old formula of stats, right?
Yes. I found early on I had to have a good sense of where the numbers really were. People didn't believe what was being published, and it was getting worse over time. What I found was that there'd been very serious methodological changes made in the numbers that ended up putting upside biases into the economic numbers and downside biases into the inflation numbers.
Okay. I want to talk about the job numbers first.
Okay.
If you can tell me, how did they calculate the job numbers in the Great Depression and in the 1960s? So we have some idea of how bad this really is. I don't even know what underemployed, I know what it means, but underemployed, there's another number where people are like, they just give up. Is that new? Did we always count that?
Well, yes and no. In the Great Depression, they did measure unemployment. The estimates on the Great Depression were made after the fact. They started surveying unemployment in the 1940s. And there were changes over time, but in 1994 they broke the system, changed severely the way things were surveyed so that the current numbers were not comparable with the earlier ones. And the headline number, which you hear each time they come out with unemployment rate was up or down, that's the what they call U3. The government has 6 levels of unemployment that it currently reports. The U3 right now is at 9.1%. Their broadest measure they call U6. That's up at 16.5%, and that's getting a little closer to what you'd get if you went around the country and asked everyone if he or she were unemployed. You'd get a much higher number than the U3, and I'll contend it's closer to 23%. The way most people would respond, and the way it was estimated after the fact for the Great Depression.
So you think the number? What was the number of the Great Depression?
Well, 25% was considered the worst in 1933, but at that time, 27% of the population lived on farms. Today, you only have 2%, and if you looked at the non-farm unemployment rate in the Great Depression, that was about 35%. I think that's what I'd compare with today's numbers. So we're still well shy of that, but we're at the worst level that's been seen post World War II. We're probably we're certainly as badly off as we were in the double dip recessions of the early 80s and the Great Recession back in 1975.
John, here's what I'm asking, because I wrote it to my staff and I said I've had enough of the funny numbers. I've had enough of the funny numbers of the economy. I've had enough of the funny numbers of the joblessness, the Fed funny number. I'm tired of it, and we have to have a standard. So what I would like to do is, I'd like to know what numbers we should be looking at that are the true rate of inflation, the true rate of unemployment that will give us some historic perspective. To say that we're comparing now and measuring differently since 1999, that doesn't give you any sense of history. So
no,
you don't know what it means.
Right. Well, the big change they made in 1994 was they eliminated part of the people that they refer to as discouraged workers. This is someone who'd normally be counted as unemployed. They want a job. They're willing and able to work. The problem is they've given up looking for work because there are no jobs to be had where they live. And
that used to be counted.
Well, they used to count all the discouraged workers. Then in 1994, they decided to count only those workers who'd been discouraged less than a year. If they'd been discouraged more than a year, they just no longer bothered to log them into the system. And that's the difference between the 16.5% that the government reports now that's broadest measure, and my 23%. The government does report 16.5%, which is, that's got to be a troubling number to anyone who looks at it, and as would be my number, which I'll contend is what you'd get if you went around and surveyed everyone in the country as to whether or not they were employed or unemployed, and that's what they tried to estimate back for the Great Depression. Okay,
so you say from the government, a number from the government would be the U6 number that we should look at.
Right.
Okay. All right. Now the next one is inflation. How was it changed? It was changed back in the 1980s, right?
Well, changes have started back. The big changes started back in the 80s, and they've done it. They did it pretty much up into 2000. The reason that most people I talk with don't believe the CPI or believe it's understated is that they still think that the CPI measures, number one, the cost of maintaining a constant standard of living, which is what you want to have in the way of a measure if you're using this to adjust your salary, or if you're using that as a target for what you need to get on your investment return. And that second, it reflects out-of-pocket expenses. It doesn't. And the changes that have been made to the series very deliberately were put into place, pushed in particularly in the 1990s in terms of getting in this concept that the CPI really is not a measure of maintaining a constant standard of living, that it's okay to have substitution, that if steak gets too expensive and people buy hamburger, that means they're not spending as much, so their cost of living's lower. That their cost of living might be lower. That's not measuring the
rate of inflation.
Right.
Okay. So they're saying the rate of inflation is what now?
Well, the official measure right now is 3.8% year over year. If you look at the popular measure, the headline number, the CPI. Okay. For all urban consumers, that's the broadest measure.
What is the real number if it was computed like it was in the 1970s?
If it was 1970s, I base it on 1980. You'd be at 11.4%, and if you based it on the way it was reported in 1990, you'd be somewhat over 7%. It's much higher. And the thing is that the government knows it's doing this deliberately. Back in the 90s, it was very clearly stated that this was a way of reducing
Social Security payments.
Payments, and that's what all this fuss was about when you had the deficit negotiations. They had a new CPI they were putting in place, but that was fully substitution based.
Okay,
they're completely abandoning the concept of measuring the cost of a constant standard of living.
John, I appreciate it. The name of the website is shadowstats.com, shadowstats.com. I thank you very much, sir, and we'll be in touch again.
You're welcome, Glenn. Thank you for having me.
You bet. I'm not gonna play with their funny numbers anymore. You got to play a different game, and you got to set the truth. You have to set the truth right. You can't have it both ways. You can't have politicians who say people are working more for less and then say that there is no rate of inflation. It's a lie. It's a lie. You can't have both. What's causing them to work more for less? Inflation. The numbers have to be told the right way. We have to go back in history so we can compare, so we know.